Mount Vesuvius is erupting. The sky above the Bay of Naples has turned the color of wet iron. 20 kilometers of ash and pumice rise into the stratosphere at the speed of a rifle bullet. Your neighbors are running toward the harbor, toward the sea, toward anywhere that is not here. And yet, inside the walls of Pompeii, roughly 2,000 Roman citizens are doing the opposite. They are locking their doors. They are gathering their children. They are sitting down beside their household shrines, and they are choosing to stay. Why? What could possibly be more terrifying than the volcano outside? That it made 2,000 human beings choose a slow, suffocating death over the open road. For 19 centuries, we assumed they were foolish, or poor, or paralyzed. But the archaeology tells a different story, a darker one. This is the anatomy of the fatal choice. To understand why 2,000 people stayed, we must first understand what they believed they were standing inside of. In late October of 79 AD, and yes, October, not August, charred autumn fruit, sealed wine dolia, and a coin minted after September 15th have all forced historians to revise the long-cited August 24th date. Pompeii was not a backwater. It was a thriving Roman provincial city of roughly 12 to 15,000 residents, perched on the fertile black soil of Campania. The wealth was visible everywhere. Marble counters at the Thermopolia, the fast food bars of the Roman world, still stained with the residue of garum and spiced wine. Bakeries with 33 loaves of bread still inside their ovens, carbonized but intact even today. Brothels with painted menus, public baths heated by hypocaust furnaces, a forum lined with the statues of emperors, and on the walls, election graffiti, lovers' insults, gladiators' scores, the chatter of a living city. Above it all stood Mount Vesuvius, green, wooded, vineyards climbing its lower slopes. The Romans did not even have a word for volcano. Pliny the Elder, the encyclopedist who would die in this disaster, had described Vesuvius in his Natural History as merely a mountain that appears to have once contained fire, past tense. This is the first piece of the puzzle. Vesuvius had not erupted in living memory, not in their grandfather's memory, not in their great-great-grandfather's memory. The last major eruption had been roughly 1,700 years earlier, the Avellino event of the Bronze Age, completely outside the Roman historical record. The mountain was background noise, furniture, sky. There had been warnings. A massive earthquake in 62 AD had cracked the temples and toppled statues. 17 years later, the city was still rebuilding. In the days before the eruption, wells ran dry, springs went still, dogs howled at nothing. But to a people without the concept of seismic precursors, these were omens to be appeased, not data to be acted on. And so, on that October morning, the bread went into the ovens, the garum was poured, the slaves swept the atria, and the prosperity that had grown in the shadow of the mountain was about to become the very thing that trapped them. When archaeologists began systematically excavating Pompeii in the 18th century, they expected to find an empty city. Instead, they found the dead. Not thousands of panicked figures in the streets, but careful, deliberate, interior deaths. Through the work of Giuseppe Fiorelli, who pioneered the plaster-cast technique in 1863, and modern bioarchaeologists like Estelle Lazaire at the University of Sydney, we can now group the stayers into three distinct categories. The first category, the possession-bound. In the house of Menander, archaeologists found a strongbox containing silver tableware so refined it took decades to catalog. In the house of the Faun, the famous Alexander mosaic stayed put. Across the city, skeletons have been found clutching keys, gripping bags of coins, lying beside hastily gathered jewelry. These were not the poor. These were the wealthy. And they did not stay because they were trapped. They stayed because what they owned was who they were. In Roman society, the domus was not merely a house, it was a sacred space, presided over by the lares and penates, the household gods, whose shrines could not simply be abandoned. To flee was to surrender lineage, status, ancestor cult, and capital all at once. Modern disaster psychologists call this possession paralysis. It is the same instinct that today makes homeowners refuse hurricane evacuation orders to stay with the house. In 79 AD, it had a religious dimension on top of the economic one, and it killed. The second category, the physically trapped. This is the category history likes to forget, because it forces us to admit that choice is a privilege. In the gladiator barracks of Pompeii, 18 skeletons were found in a single room. Several still wore iron shackles. They had no choice. The slaves chained to grain mills, the prisoners in the city jail, the elderly bedridden in upper floor cubicula, the heavily pregnant. Bioarchaeological analysis has identified at least one woman in her third trimester among the dead, and the disabled. Estelle Laze's skeletal surveys have documented numerous individuals with severe arthritis, untreated fractures, and degenerative conditions that would have made even a short flight across cobblestones impossible. For these people, the eruption did not present a choice. It presented a sentence, handed down by a society that had already decided their mobility did not matter. The third category, the informed optimists. These are the ones whose deaths are the hardest to bear, because they were reasoning. Pompeii had survived the great earthquake of 62 AD. It had survived smaller tremors in the years since. The eruption began not as a pyroclastic horror, but as a falling rain of pumice, small, light, almost weightless stones. For the first several hours, residents could walk through the streets, brush ash from their shoulders, and tell themselves, "The mountain has done this before. It will pass." Pliny the Younger, watching from across the bay at Misenum, recorded that his uncle, Pliny the Elder, commander of the Roman fleet, initially treated the column rising over Vesuvius as a curiosity worth studying, not a catastrophe worth fleeing. If the empire's greatest natural philosopher could miscalculate, what chance did a baker have? The optimists waited. They sheltered indoors as the pumice fell, reasoning that walls were safer than open streets, where stones now fell hard enough to crack a skull. They were right, for a while. And then, the rules of the disaster changed. Here is what the stayers did not know. The volcanologists who have reconstructed the eruption, Haraldur Sigurdsson and Giuseppe Mastro Lorenzo among the most cited, have broken it into two phases, and the boundary between them is the boundary between survivable and unsurvivable. The first phase, the Plinian phase, named for the very witness who described it, lasted roughly 18 hours. Pumice fell, the sky darkened, roofs began to groan under the accumulating weight. In some districts, ash piled at the rate of 15 centimeters per hour. A tiled Roman roof could bear perhaps 40 centimeters before the wooden beams beneath it failed. By midnight, doors that had opened outward could no longer open at all. Pumice had drifted against them like snow against a barn. Windows, small, high, designed for ventilation, not escape, were blocked. The very shelter that had protected the optimists from falling stones had become their tomb. This is the moment that haunts the archaeology. Plaster casts from the upper levels of houses show figures pressed against ceilings, in attics, on stairwells, people who climbed upward as the ash rose around them, only to be buried from above when the roofs gave way. And then, around 1 a.m, the eruption changed character. The towering column of ash, no longer supported by the heat beneath it, collapsed. What had been falling vertically now began racing horizontally. A pyroclastic surge of superheated gas, ash, and rock, moving at over 100 kilometers per hour at temperatures between 200 and 500 degrees Celsius. The first surge struck Herculaneum just after midnight. The second, third, and fourth swept down toward Pompeii in the pre-dawn hours of the second day. By the time the fourth surge reached the city walls, anyone still alive inside them had perhaps 15 seconds of awareness left. Bioarchaeologist Pier Paolo Petrone has demonstrated, through analysis of bone fractures and skull patterns, that death in the pyroclastic surge was not slow suffocation as romantic 19th century paintings imagined. It was thermal shock. Muscles contracted instantly in what is called the pugilistic posture, the boxer's stance that we see in nearly every cast. Brains, in some Herculaneum cases, vitrified into glass. The stayers did not drown in ash. They were turned to statues mid-breath. What the casts show us, more than anything, is composure. There are panicked figures, yes. The dog in the house of Orpheus, twisting against its leash. The man in the Garden of the Fugitives, face down, arms extended. But there are also, and this is what the early excavators found unbearable, the calm ones. Families seated together. A mother cradling an infant against her chest, her own body arched as a shield. Two sisters embracing in a back room. An elderly couple lying side by side on a bed, hands clasped. A slave who, given the chance to flee, stayed beside his mistress and was found at her feet. The historian Mary Beard has written that the archaeology of Pompeii is, in the end, less a record of how Romans died than a record of what they decided mattered in the last minutes. And what mattered, again and again, was each other. Pliny the Younger, writing to the historian Tacitus some 25 years later, gave us the only contemporary eyewitness account. He describes his mother begging him to leave her behind, to save himself. He refused. He took her hand. They walked together through ash so thick that the sun, he wrote, was extinguished as in a sealed room. He survived. She survived.
Pliny the Elder, who had sailed toward the eruption to rescue friends and to study it, did not. He died on the beach at Stabiae, likely of cardiac arrest brought on by ash inhalation. His body recovered 3 days later, looking more like a sleeper than a dead man. Pliny the Younger's account is precious not only because it is the only one, but because of what it implies about the 2000. If a senator's family, on the safer side of the bay, considered abandoning each other unthinkable, what did a baker's family in Pompeii consider unthinkable? The answer is written in the casts. They considered separation unthinkable, so they stayed together, and together they died. The terrible irony is this: their fatal choice gave us an immortal record. Because they remained inside their homes, the ash sealed them in place. Because the ash sealed them in place, their bodies left voids. Voids that, 18 centuries later, Fiorelli filled with plaster and gave back to history. The stayers became the only Romans we can still see. For most of the last 2 millennia, we treated Pompeii as a freak event, a cautionary tale from a vanished world. But modern disaster sociology has discovered something uncomfortable. The 2000 are not historical anomalies. They are statistically typical. Studies of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, of the Camp Fire in California in 2018, of the Lahaina Fire in 2023, all converge on the same number. Roughly 10 to 15% of any population given a mandatory evacuation order will refuse. They will refuse for the same 3 reasons the Pompeians refused: attachment to property, physical or social entrapment, and a rational, evidence-based optimism that turns out to be wrong. The wealthy who would not leave their houses in 79 AD have the same psychological profile as the homeowners who hose down their roofs as wildfires approach. The chained slaves of Pompeii have their parallel in the nursing home residents of Hurricane Katrina, the prisoners not evacuated from flooded parishes, the disabled left behind in every disaster. The informed optimists of Vesuvius are the same people who, today, watch the radar and decide their neighborhood has always flooded a little, and this time will be no different. Pompeii is not ancient history. Pompeii is a mirror. The fatal choice is not a decision made once by 2,000 strangers in a city most of us will never visit. It is a decision being made somewhere on Earth, right now, by someone who believes the storm will turn, the fire will skip their street, the mountain will go back to sleep. Pompeii was a test of civilization, and tests have a way of repeating. Anyways, I'm your narrator, watching the past bleed into the present, and together, we remember when time bled. In the next era, we go inside the plague that killed a quarter of medieval Europe and meet the doctors who tried to stop it with beaks full of flowers. I'll see you there.